I'm Alex Radcliffe from Board Game Co, and today I'm reviewing the Reckoners Steelslayer, the expansion to the Reckoners from Nauvoo Games. And this is an expansion review, so to some extent I will assume some basic knowledge of the original The Reckoners game, but as a high-level overview, in the Reckoners you play as the Reckoners from the book series by Brandon Sanderson, and you're taking out a variety of, overpowered epics that are trying to take you down. Ultimately you have Steelheart as the big bad. You're going to take a bit of a Yahtzee-style action mechanism where you're going to roll dice on your turn, re-rolling all your dice up to 3 times, keeping a minimum of 1 die per roll, and then utilizing to accomplish your actions, followed by the bad stuff happening, which involves new epics arriving, epics activating all their abilities, which are activated by these rows, powering up as well, and then finally Steelheart, the big bad himself, activating. Rinse and repeat until either, you die, usually resulting in the population track of the city falling apart, or alternatively, you take out Steelheart. That's the core concept of the Reckoners as a concept. It's a cooperative game with powers and abilities, cards, equipment, all these things, and let's talk about Steelslayer. What does Steelslayer add to the picture? So Steelslayer adds a bunch of new things, and I'm going to go over them one at a time, and then, of course, followed by my opinion of the expansion, how it fares, how it improves, or makes the game better, worse, all of those things, timestamps as usual, in the bar down below. But as far as the new stuff, firstly, off the bat, you have 4 new Reckoners. You're going to have Valentine over here, Excel, you have Sam, and Mizzy. These are all going to be characters, I assume, from the new novels. Honestly, I've only ever read the first original Reckoners book. I need to follow through on the rest of them. I enjoyed the one book I read. But either way, we have 4 new characters, each bringing 4 new abilities to the table. These characters are going to slot over your original boards over here, so I could pull out that little sheet. I just don't need to, so I'm overlaying them on top of other sheets as needed to basically just give me the character boards that I need quick and easy access. But you're going to get those little sheets over there, like I said, with their own unique ability. That's what it is. Each character comes with 1 card, which is the unique thing that defines them from other characters. Then we have new equipment. We have a giant stack of new equipment over here. This is the stack of equipment, and we've added a whole bunch of new equipment cards to it. It's worth noting that the game also does have a few minor tweaks to some original base game cards. No major changes there, just 3 or 4 cards that you'll have to replace or proxy in or out. Not proxy, to just replace. But then you have the new equipment over here, which gives you just new symbols, new equipment, new stuff for your equipment pile that you can go through, enjoy to utilize its resources. Equipment is a core part of the Reckoner's experience because every single round you're going to be earning money to power yourself up even further by spending that money on equipment which will help you down the road. The Reckoners tends to start with you being very, very much at a disadvantage, and you're fighting an uphill battle to effectively try to win before they take you down, again taking the population down usually. And so getting equipment is a huge part of the game, and we just have a chunk full of new equipment cards. We also have new epics. In fact, the entire epic deck from the original Reckoners has been replaced with this new deck. You won't need the old epics at all, which to the perfectionist in me, I should throw them out, but I'm having a hard time doing so. But we have new epics. We have new epics over here, a whole bunch of new epics, some new cards, new actual characters, and then all the other characters tweaked in some way, either to streamline their abilities in different ways or to add new gameplay mechanics, so you have a good mix of the new gameplay mechanics on the new epics. You're going to want to factor that in as well as you go through the game. And there are some new mechanics. Speaking of which, the next thing it adds is new mechanics. There are a few different things. I'm going to focus on the biggest new mechanic changes. First of all, we have shields and, I don't actually know what they're called, but we have 2 different types of shield tokens in the game. These are going to be tokens that go down the board on city locations, preventing bad things from happening to the city location. You'll have tokens over here that prevent the enforcement from being hit. You'll have to spend hits on these tokens first before you spend them on the enforcement, which basically means they get in your way. They're not enforcement itself, so they don't come with all the downsides that enforcement comes with, but they get in your way in a similar sense, and you can't take on enforcement until you take on those shield tokens. Additionally, we have the same idea, but this time for the epics themselves. Generally, you're trying to contain epics. You're trying to limit their power, both for the big bad themselves, as well as the individual epics, sliding this bar to the left to minimize how many bad things they can do on their turn. These tokens over here are going to prevent that. You'll have to take these out in a location before you actually contain the epic themselves. So again, like the other red tokens, they're providing a blocker to the game. Additionally, we have these copy epic actions. These are tokens that will go down the board, and it will result in the epic at that location taking the first, second, third, etc. actions a second time. So for instance, if this epic's on the 3rd track over here, and we have 2 copy epic actions, the first 2 actions on that epic track we're going to do twice, and then the 3rd one once. If we only have 1, we'll do the first action twice, and then the rest once. So these are again, going to get in your way, and these you can get rid of just by discarding a die, no different than walking around the board or getting rid of barricades. They're easy to get rid of, but they take your limited resources, and resources are very limited in the game. And then the big thing, although everything else was already a lot of stuff, but I would argue that the biggest thing is going to be the addition of new bosses and new cities to the game. You're going to have 2 new bosses. You're going to have Regalia and Limelight, each coming with their own associated city. So each city and each boss brings new mechanics to the gameplay. Strictly speaking, you can cross things left, right, and center. You can use Steelheart with one of the new cities. You can use Regalia with any location you want. You could do whatever you want as far as mixing and matching. That said, that's not recommended until later, and I haven't bothered doing that. I haven't felt the need to mix or match yet. The bosses are, for the most part, designed or balanced around the city that comes with them. So you're mostly going to think of it as pairing up a new boss in a new city. So you have 3 locations and bosses to fight against, in a sense. Although, again, cross-contamination, totally possible. Cross-contamination is probably the wrong term. Cross-whatever, totally possible. Just that note as far as their recommendation. As far as the new bosses, they add a few new things to the game, as well as the locations. The bosses are going to add, well, different types of things. Regalia has an interesting aspect to Regalia in the sense that she is more vulnerable than other bosses in the game. She starts off without a prime invincibility. A prime invincibility is the idea that certain epics within the universe of the Reckoners have something that stops them from being killed, so you have to research them to make them more, well, vulnerable. You have to figure out what their weakness is. Regalia doesn't have that, so she spends the entire time in hiding, which means instead you're going to be spending your research in the various city locations. I have this set up over here for Regalia, as if she's playing right now, and these look, well, not fully set up, just a few locations over here. These locations, you're going to be researching all the locations, bringing it down to the very bottom track. So when you spend research in a location, you can assign it there. Additionally, when you earn boss research from these epics that you take out, you can apply it to the location instead. And so you're going to slowly be moving down the track, getting the good things and or bad things that happen as you move down. And then once all the tracks and all the cities are researched, you've effectively found where Regalia is hiding, and that's where you can take her down. And she starts with very little health. She starts with, well, it depends on the difficulty level you're playing with, but very little health relative to another boss. That's going to be the primary aspect Regalia plays. Some minor nuances as far as other things going on. You have a deck of cards that Regalia has as far as bad things she's doing to limit the Reckoners, and you have these helpful cards over here that will give you extra boons and perks that you can cash in as well. That's going to be what's going on with Regalia. The other boss in location, we have Limelight. Limelight over here. Limelight has his own little book of actions. So he has his own interesting epic action track, which is going to basically reference this book. This is a lot of symbols. If you're wondering how many symbols this is a absolute ton of symbols you'll be cross-referencing, which does mean it can be a bit of a pain to match everything. What I will say is, however difficult you think this looks, it's not that difficult. I'll talk about this in my opinion section, but it's not as bad as it looks. I know because I looked at it and got scared, and it's not as bad as it looks. But either way, we'll talk about that shortly. But he has his own giant nuanced track to activate based on the player count, based on what's going on, based on all the difficulty scaling, all of that stuff. And then his city has this interesting action as far as the city themselves is trying to basically hurt you, as you're going to have this little track that moves around the city locations, activating all the abilities on the track. So every round you're trying to contain the locations of the city themselves to stop the city from kind of powering up against you. Thematically, the city's crumbling around you, but you're trying to basically balance a whole other aspect of something else that has to be contained. In addition to the bosses, in addition to the enforcement, in addition to the epics, you'll have to contain the city itself. And that is basically... No, wait, one last thing. We have a bunch of cards for the original location. In order to make the original location more interesting, you have these optional cards you can add to Newcago, that these cards are going to go on locations in the original city, giving you something bad that happens during the Reckoner's phase, as well as something good that happens at that specific location. So again, just adding more variability. You have an A side and a B side. Just, I guess they wanted to make the original locations more interesting, because now that we have locations that actually matter, that actually feel different, they're doing the same to the original city locations. And with that, we can go ahead and move into what I like, don't like, the changes, general impressions around this expansion, what it brings to the table, is it worth picking up, all of that. And for the most part, there's not a lot of bad here. There's going to be divided up into the things I like and the things that I don't know if they necessarily improved my experience. So just going quickly through all those aspects, the new Reckoners, I mean, more characters is always a good thing, so I like all the characters. I like genuinely all the characters. Sam's a bit of a specialist, getting unique special dice for all these things, and having a little more control around his rolls. Excel over here gets to basically copy, gets to add a symbol to one of his dice every single round. Valentine over here is going to give you an extra move or removing a barricade. And Mizzy is likely my favorite over here, because Mizzy can power up her explosives every single round and then take a boom action where you just collapse everything, dealing 7 damage straight to an epic, to the boss themselves, to whatever you need. So Mizzy and Sam are probably my favorites. but all the characters being something new to the table. New equipment, again, always a good thing. Easily just more variety to the experience, more good things there, that's great. The new epics. The new epics themselves, I would say that for the most part, they add more symbol variety to the game. There's new symbols to the game. There's going to be a whole, in the expansion book, you'll see tons of just different symbols, the way they operate, and like the base game, they have that same regular problem that you kind of need to mentally familiarize yourself with all the symbology, but once you do, it's fairly easy to remember what they do. It's overwhelming at first, takes a game or two to get under your belt, but the new symbols, just like the old symbols, are there, and you'll have to get used to them, and it's not that bad once you know them. But I would say that overall, I appreciate the new epics without necessarily feeling as strongly about their addition. I want new characters, I want new equipment, I like the new epics and their use and the way they combine with the new mechanics, but it's good, it's not necessarily as great. Speaking of which, the new mechanics. New mechanics I'm a little mixed on. They have, I would say overall I like the new mechanics. The shields, the copy epic action tokens. For the most part, I would say I like what they bring to the table, but also at times I don't feel they mattered as much. And it is situational. It depends on the game. It depends on which character you're fighting against. It depends on if you're fighting against Limelight. Limelight often takes advantage of those symbols on the board a lot more in some of his actions. And then similarly, we have epics. So you have some epics that will interact with those symbols more, making them matter more. Now, what I mean by that is something like adding this token to the board, for the most part, it is not that functionally different than just adding another enforcement token to the board, which means it's a mechanic without necessarily having a ton of benefit. And same idea over here. These ones perhaps a little bit more matter because they don't power up the epics, but I find in most of our games, we're so often trying to take out the enforcement anyways as much as possible all the time that these don't have that much of an impact. That said, there are some abilities, like I said in Limelight himself, as well as some epics, that will reference the number of tokens in a spot, and when the game does that, it matters a bit more. These copy epic action tokens, I find these far more frustrating, because I'm often inclined to just let them slip by, because they're so flat and not really threatening you. They don't go here, they go here. They're flat, they're not really threatening you, they're not getting in the way, until suddenly you're doing the action on that epic twice in the game. And so these I like a lot more. Overall, I would say I enjoy the new mechanics without feeling I would have liked to see them interact with more on a higher scale. For right now, the only interaction I've seen in my plays are Limelight and then some epics, and then that's, I'd like to see more. I'd like to see more interaction with those tokens. Past that, we go to the new bosses and cities, and this is where we have the biggest gap over here. Now, first of all, as far as the new bosses and cities, new bosses are fairly easy to plug in and out because they fit into this tray very easily. You're talking about 2-3 swapperoos, you're all good to go. New cities is a bit more work because you have to pull out the old city, put the new one in. It's not a ton of setup, but I would say the Reckoners already has a decent amount of setup, and it can potentially add an extra 5 to 10 minutes to your setup, maybe 10's pushing it, but easily 5 minutes, possibly a drop more, as far as extra setup if you are switching the existing city and boss. That's something to take into account. Not a big deal, but for me, I certainly have a preference towards playing the same boss city combo a few times in a row before shifting it out to a new one, just because I don't want to deal with that extra 5 minutes on top of the game. It's not, again, not a big deal, but it's certainly present. Past that, as far as what they bring to the table. So first of all, let's start with these cards over here. These cards, I can take or leave them. They are fine. They do add extra difficulty to the game, so if that's what you're looking for, and if you want a pivot from the usual difficulty scaling system that the game has, they're good, but I don't like how kind of just, I don't like the visual presence they have on the table, and I don't find them to be as, I guess, present. They're fine, they do the job, they give some reason to matter as far as why one city location is different than another. They're totally fine, if they weren't in the game, I wouldn't have necessarily minded. As far as the new bosses and locations on the other hand, that's where I'm definitely, well, I like them a lot more. They bring a lot more to the table, with caveats. Regalia I very much do enjoy. I find she has a totally different spin to how you have to handle the game because of all the research actions taking place in the city locations and because of her weakened health. I really enjoy her aspect there, as well as the matching city locations, the way you have a track that matters. In both the new city locations, I do appreciate how you have these tracks where you have something else to be mindful of. One of my complaints against the Reckoners is the fact that the city locations never really felt different. This is an opportunity to try to remedy that I'm okay with, but I like the new city locations and how they often really do genuinely feel different in terms of the way they change the game's scaling or pacing or where one city location matters to another. Far more often in this game, I'm like, we have to move to the next location. We have to get over to Grand Central because Grand Central isn't fully researched. So I felt more like I'm actually going on these little mini missions as opposed to just surviving until we can fully research the big bad. As far as Limelight, Limelight is good, with the caveat that I like a lot of what Limelight does, and he has an extra level of threat that he brings to the table, and I like the variety he brings to the table. His sequence of actions is a lot less just straight than Regalia's. And this chart over here that I already said looks overwhelming is not that bad once you get into it. It is overwhelming at first, and there is a lot of checking, but it's kind of basic checking, and it's not that difficult. You reference the A, B, C, or whatever on this board over here, you cross-check on this, you're going to have this open in front of you the whole time, you're not flipping pages or anything like that, so it's a little overwhelming, but it also adds a lot of variety to the table. And his location as well, I found to be the most pressure as far as just trying to stay ahead of these cities crumbling around you. Overall, for the most part, I like all the things that this expansion brings to the table, or in some cases, I'm only okay with them. Which brings us to the, is it worth it? Should you pick this one up? I would say if you are someone who is pulling out the Reckoners once or twice a year, you probably don't need this expansion. It's going to add further variety to your experience, don't get me wrong, but if you're only playing the Reckoners once or twice a year, I don't know if that's necessarily worth it. Depends on, what price point you can find this at, all of that. I like a lot of the stuff, I just don't know if it's necessary for someone who's playing the Reckoners that infrequently. On the other hand, if you're someone like myself, who I actually like playing the Reckoners a lot more, but one of the reasons I actually don't play it that much is because of the fact that I like having the pacing between games, because I find the Reckoners is a game that past my first 5 or 6 plays, it started to feel a bit samey, and this expansion certainly gives more ways to mix that up. If you want to play the Reckoners today and you want to play it again next week, shift up another boss if you're bored of the game. You're going to have more equipment, you're going to have more epics, you're going to have more everything to keep the experience fresher for longer. So I guess overall, I think if you are someone who wants to play this game more, it's definitely worth picking up. If you're someone who's playing this one infrequently, that's more of a toss-up as far as whether you feel it's worth it or not. As far as final thoughts and rating for myself, to me the expansion easily takes the Reckoners from a solid 4 to a 4.5. I always loved the Reckoners and how I like the Yahtzee-style dice mechanism in most games that I play, and just rolling dice, trying to get what you want and applying it. And the Reckoners often has you feeling like you're just taking powerful, powerful turns where you get to do a ton of stuff before the game comes crashing back down on your heads, reminding you that you're not actually winning if the population track is shrinking further and further downwards as you slowly inevitably die. And then gathering new equipment and leveling up and just having a better, more increasingly feeling in control of the situation with each passing round as you hopefully slowly creep your way to victory. I like the game that the Reckoners brings. One of my bigger complaints was about the lack of variety, was about the fact that it can feel a little samey as you continue to dive into the same experience time and time again, and this definitely does shift that up. So this one has easily moved the Reckoners from a 4 to a 4.5 for me. It's more content, more accessible content for a game I enjoy. For the most part, it adds stuff. I would have loved to see, and I know this would have added to the cost, but I would have loved to see these as just fully new player boards instead of the way they have them over here. Again, these are fine, just they feel a little out of place, and often the city boards are difficult enough to track, and we already are adding more tokens here, here, and here to the board to track. But overall, it's a solid game, which adds more challenge and more variety to the experience. Until next time, I'm Alex Radcliffe from Board Game Co. I hope you found this helpful, and as always, have a good one.